This podcast may contain general advice, but it does not take into account anyone's personal circumstances, needs, or objectives. The scenarios and stocks mentioned in this podcast are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute a recommendation to buy, hold, or sell any financial products. Importantly, the opinions expressed in this podcast are the personal views of the speakers and are not necessarily representative of Betashares' views. Thanks for tuning in to Practice Makes Perfect with your host, Damon Riscalla.
Good morning. This is Damon Riscalla with the Practice Makes Perfect podcast for Betashares. And today I am joined by Kieran Pepper from CyberCX. Kieran, welcome.
G'day, Damo. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Obviously, cybersecurity, very, very topical at the moment. We thought it'd be useful to bring our audience some insights and information from someone who's quite experienced in the area. We've, of course, seen the Optus issues, Medibank. From a financial planning perspective, we had Retire Invest that had their own problems not so long ago with a landmark court case. So we are seeing it rise in prominence as an issue. Very keen to hear your thoughts, but before we do that, maybe we can just get a bit of a background on yourself and what you do day to day and a little bit about your firm and what you guys do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, I haven't been in cybersecurity my entire career. I actually started out working in superannuation fund call centers, and then moving through financial services organizations and doing business improvement, process improvement type of work. So I'm really familiar with, I guess, both the customers and the way that financial advisors go about doing things. A few years ago, I decided to redirect my career into cybersecurity, and I did a master's of cybersecurity management at Swinburne University, and I work at CyberCX as a manager in our strategy and consulting practice. So CyberCX is a sovereign Australian-owned organisation. We have a variety of different capabilities. The one that I work in, strategy and consulting, is really about bridging the gap between business and security issues. And helping organizations solve some of those really complicated cybersecurity problems.
Perfect. No, that gives us a great background. And look, it's I think it's always useful to talk to someone that's sat on both sides of the fence. So your experience with financial planners, I'm sure, puts you in a very good spot for today's conversation. In terms of cybersecurity is a term that does get thrown around a lot. What does it mean to you?
That's a really good question, Damo. So when we talk about cybersecurity, I think there are kind of two interpretations of it. The definition I prefer to go with is that cybersecurity is the verb of how we secure our digital assets. So that's going to be our systems, our data, our mobile phones, that sort of thing. So cybersecurity generally targets making sure that we maintain confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So if we put that in the context of, let's say, your classic financial advisor SME, confidentiality is making sure that your customers' data remains private and safe within your organization. So it's not disclosed to unauthorized individuals, or it's not accessed by cyber criminals. So in Australia, we have obviously the Australian Privacy Act, and that classifies data as personal data and sensitive data. Now, my experience with financial advisors, I think you will have both typically in your organization, particularly if you do anything around insurance, because sensitive data is where we start to get into health information, people's backgrounds and stuff like that. So confidentiality is obviously really important. You can get fined if you are in breach of some of the Australian privacy principles. Integrity is another really important one for a financial advisory business, because it's about making sure that the data in your systems isn't changed. So a really good example of how this happens and how cyber criminals attack this is they may get into your system and change the BSB and account number on your invoices. So you're sending out invoices to get paid, everyone's paying it into the wrong bank account. It can get a bit more serious when we're talking about people's, individual financial positions. We want to make sure that, we're accurately reflecting their financial transactions. Nothing kind of dodgy is happening along the way there. The last one, availability, is really just making sure that you can access your systems and data when you need to, but also in a time that you would expect it to be provided in as well. So, when we go to a website, we expect it to load pretty quickly. Just like when we want to access data, it should be, pretty quick. And if you think about, if you come to work one day and you cannot access any of your customers' data, you can't access, any of your, Word or Excel files or something like that, that would have a massive impact to your business.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you've raised some very good points. And look, around the traps, I know that there are a number of advisors out there that are acutely aware of how much information they do hold on clients, from health information through to tax file numbers, through to investment amounts. Like, it's a plethora that covers all gamuts of someone's life. So I can certainly understand why people are increasingly concerned about how they protect against these threats. One thing that I'd love to know is, from your experience thus far, do you think that these attacks are becoming, or these issues around cybersecurity, are they becoming more prevalent, or is it just that we're hearing more about them in the press these days?
So they are becoming more prevalent, and we are hearing about them a lot more in the press. Cybersecurity issues are caused by cybercrime. So it's essentially it's crime. And there's a concept called routine activity theory, which is how crime occurs. So essentially, you need to have a likely offender, a suitable victim, and the lack of a capable guardian. So if we kind of put that in the context of our everyday lives, a suitable victim, all organizations have to rely on IT today. You can't avoid it. If you want to be efficient and effective with your operations, you need to be using IT systems. You need to be able to access the internet, that sort of stuff. So when we talk about suitable victims, a lot of organizations fall into that category. In terms of likely offenders, one of the best things about the internet is connected all of us. We can talk to each other anywhere in the world, but what that means is that the barrier, which we wouldn't kind of normally associate, there's no suburbs, there's no ocean between countries on the internet. Anyone in the world could target pretty much any organization that is, has something on the internet, which is pretty much every organization. The last one is the lack of a capable guardian. So generally speaking, we're not particularly good at cybersecurity, and we're not particularly good, maybe from a business standpoint, of understanding how IT works. We know that we use it, we know that we log into it and what we have to press and stuff like that. We don't really kind of understand, what's behind the scenes. So because we rely on technology for our kind of day-to-day lives, we assume that technology can keep us safe and all of that. But cybersecurity is about, people, processes, and systems. So coming back to the lack of a capable guardian, because we don't have like a strong understanding of what we're trying to protect, there's low security awareness in our organizations. There's really no one to protect us from this except for ourselves. So if we cannot guard ourselves, we can't, we're essentially creating that perfect storm which enables cybercrime to exist. I think the second point for this as well is thinking about what's happened with technology lately. So I was talking about how the internet has connected everyone. There has been an explosion of internet connectivity. You've got an iPad, we've got laptops, we've got mobile phones. We're now getting all sorts of, IoT devices like security cameras, which all connect into our network. And this is the same place that we store our, our confidential client information and that sort of thing. I think another thing to consider is, the way IT is run. We used to have, lots and lots of people, like with a one-to-one relationship with the systems that they look after. Now we have one person who looks after 100 systems. So in cybersecurity, we talk about a thing called your attack surface. And that's essentially the places that an attacker could target to try and get in and access your data. So because of this explosion of interconnectivity, and because we've changed the way that we do things, got more efficient, there's a lot more stuff to secure, which makes it harder to secure because there's a money element to all of this. How much can we afford to pay?
Sure. So we're being attacked on all fronts. And obviously, that's a great point. The explosion, I guess, of people having access to the internet and connectivity makes us all the more susceptible to these types of attacks. From your standpoint, do you see these attacks, the effects of them, are they becoming worse? Are the end results becoming more dramatic for those that are subject to these attacks?
I would say so. So the ACSC noted in 2022 that in their 2022 annual cyber threat report that one cybercrime was reported every 7 minutes. Now, in the previous year, for the 2021 report, one cybercrime was being reported every 8 minutes. They also include in that same report that about 60% or thereabouts of SME or SMB organizations experience some form of cyber incident. They are becoming worse. COVID-19 has definitely kind of helped move that along because, again, when we go back to what I was saying about the attack surface, more people were working from home, more devices to secure, that sort of thing. Another thing that's making it worse is that it's a very lucrative crime market. And underneath that, there is this massive ecosystem. We have people who focus on just stealing your username and password, and then selling that to somebody else who will then use that to get access to your company's network or your company's IT assets. We also have cybercrime organizations who offer ransomware as a service. And this is the thing I find really fascinating about this. They've got actual businesses. They have customer service teams. So if somebody comes and deploys ransomware in your environment, they'll offer you a call center that you can call to get help, obviously once you've paid the ransom, to actually help you get access to your data again. It's not, the typical...
It's an industry within an industry.
Absolutely. And it's not, people in their basement in hoodies, the typical, guy in a hoodie, downstairs in the dark with, Matrix style text on the screen. It's a full-blown ecosystem and it's very profitable.
From one of the things that I've been curious about, the formats of these attacks, the most, is there sort of a standout or most common form of attack that you see coming through?
Yeah, sure. So we kind of classify the most common attack into what we refer to as social engineering. So we've all heard of phishing. And phishing is essentially where they try and get you to click on a link or open a file in an email or something like that. And then once you do, it infects your computer with malware, which is malicious software, and that gives them access to your PC. So it was very opportunistic. If we're looking like the kind of early 2000s, like the late 90s, this stuff just kind of was out there on the internet and was relatively untargeted, that sort of thing. And again, it was very opportunistic. But as we've progressed and more things have happened, cyber criminals have become a lot more targeted. So, for example, they will go and look at your organization's LinkedIn page and find somebody, maybe the accounts payable person or somebody in your customer service team. They'll have a look at the photos of them and try and work out what their age is and maybe gauge whether they would be a good person for them to try and, send a phishing email to. So that kind of targeted, considered nature is why social engineering is really effective, because they're essentially hacking the human and tricking them into doing something which creates that one opportunity to get into the network, into your systems.
Sure, that's amazing that they can be so detailed in that type of approach and really drill down that much. I'm shocked by that.
Well, it really makes you think, if you were to reflect upon what you have on the internet about yourself, and people generally don't have particularly good password habits. So, if you've got a photo of your dog or a photo of your cat or maybe your favorite football team, or, you've named one of your children on your Facebook profile, or, you put a post up somewhere, maybe we can start to gather a little bit of intelligence on you. It's called open source intelligence. And, try and put together a little bit of a profile to be like, what is this person's password likely to be? Yeah, it's really interesting, and it is something that we have to take really seriously.
So they go through this detailed approach. The information that they're looking for, what is most valuable to them?
Oof. It's a really good question, and we need to all come back down to like the motive and the intent. So let's talk about the types of people that actually target organizations, and we can kind of work a little bit backwards from there.
Sure.
So, you have the kind of those opportunistic people who are just trying to kind of get in and do something, but it's relatively untargeted. You have hacktivists who are really trying to make some form of political message, and their intention is normally to, deface something or cause embarrassment.
Sure.
You have cyber criminals who are going to want to find ways to make money from you. And then we also have, like espionage and nation state. Now, that's a massive topic in itself, and I kind of won't go there for the purpose of this discussion today. So going back to, organized crime or cyber criminals, they're targeting things like login credentials, so like usernames and passwords. They want financial information and, that personal data or sensitive data. Now, some people refer it to as, personally identifiable information. They use those terms, they're kind of interchangeable, but essentially they're thinking about how they can gain access and steal money from you, or get your data and sell it for money, obviously,
Sure.
or get access to data which you are supposed to be keeping confidential and extort you.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's useful tips, in terms of what people are looking to do out there. The impacts of COVID, people working from home a heck of a lot more, this work from home type of environment, which does not look like it's going to stop. If anything, it's gathering momentum. Does that leave us more vulnerable in terms of cyber attacks?
So it really depends about how, an organization has gone about enabling work, like remote work. So immediately to answer your question, yes, it has created more opportunities. And the reason being is that when you're in the office, the computer that you're working on is normally connected to the network inside the office. Whereas when you're working from home, it's got to connect to the network, obviously via the internet, to be able to access, your systems and data and stuff like that.
Yes.
So if you control the device that accesses your network, generally speaking, you have, some kind of security controls in place already. So that's, at least in my opinion, a little bit better. But when you let people use their own personal device, that's where we start to see maybe a little bit more kind of ugliness come into it. Because, if the same person who can access, your client's information is using that endpoint, that laptop, to surf the web, their kids maybe play, internet games on it. Mm-hmm. We're watching Netflix and stuff like that. There's not a clear separation between your kind of what you would do in your personal life and your professional life. And that creates more opportunities for people to, click on the wrong thing or open an email attachment. Or maybe they're not keeping that device up to date. Maybe it's a laptop they bought, 10 years ago. And it runs an old operating system that we actually can't secure anymore, because these things change.
Sure. To extend on that even further, I mean, we sit here today, I've got my iPad, I'll go out later on and be using my iPhone. Do these mobile devices, along the same lines, do they represent a higher degree of susceptibility to these attacks?
So yes and no. So the risk that they represent is that there's going to be, sensitive information on them. So the device could be lost or stolen. And if somebody could, get into it and actually take the data out, that is not a particularly good thing, obviously. Also, you could probably install, the apps and stuff like that that you want to install on it. And I know we're going to talk about this a little later, but sometimes, the apps that you install are, they have, malware hidden in them, which, gives access. The good things about mobile devices is that they have been putting a lot of effort into, like the security of them. The iPad that you've got in front of you, Apple's done a lot of work with, I think it's their TSM, their Trusted Security Module, or the Secure Enclave on board with that. And that actually gives us and gives security practitioners more avenues, to put in place things like MFA. So yes, it causes more of a risk because there is data which realistically should be, confidential to your organization on these devices. But that being said, a lot of good work is being done to keep these secure and help us create, better security outcomes by leveraging them.
And as part of that, I guess one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is that humans, often are our own worst enemy in many of these things. How do we contribute to our own demise? What are the most common things that you see?
Oh, geez. So I think the first thing is, we maybe have a greater perception of our security than what's actually in reality. So I've looked at, my password decisions that I've made over an extended period of time, and they were, nowadays they're very, very predictable. So how we contribute to our own demise as individuals is, we don't keep things up to date. We don't use strong passwords. And we don't have a good understanding of what I would say basic hygiene is. What I mean by basic hygiene is, it's you're brushing your teeth, you're washing, having a shower every day, that type of thing. You need to apply those same principles to your, your digital life. And you can't, I can't rely on the fact that you've brushed your teeth to, make sure that, my emails don't get breached. That's on me. So I have to take personal accountability for that. Taking back a step to the organizational context and how they kind of maybe contribute to their, I think contributing to their own demise is not the way of putting it because, generally speaking, if you are a victim of a cyber attack, you are a victim of a crime.
Sure.
So having a lack of understanding or awareness, that's going to be one of the main causes, and it's going to become less and less acceptable from a public perception point of view, and even a regulatory perspective, for you to continue not understanding, cybersecurity and having that kind of basic hygiene. So, making sure that you're keeping stuff up to date. So if you're, giving all of your employees laptops that are 10 years old, it's very likely that they're running, old operating systems, and that just is not acceptable anymore. We have to be, keeping things up to date so we can maintain that kind of baseline level of security. So to summarize what I just said for the organizational context, it's the lack of understanding or the unwillingness to understand it more, as well as, lack of keeping things up to date. Probably just one last point to add to that, is an over-reliance on technology. So as I said at the start, cybersecurity is the doing. It's not, it's not the outcomes. So if you are relying purely on technology, you're going I've just got an antivirus on my computer, and we've got a firewall because, the IT guy said that we need to have it. That's, that kind of technology-led outcome. You need to think about the people in your organization. You need to think about the processes that they follow, and then technology supports security across people and processes. You could have, the latest cutting-edge antivirus tool, but if you're, a person in your organization isn't trained to, check an email for a suspicious link or for something that may be a flag, then, well, you've undone all of the great efforts and the money that you spent on that antivirus product.
Yeah, things to be aware of for sure. If I can change tack just for a minute. So you've just spoken of the organizational responsibilities. If we're looking at things from that perspective, how should companies manage their vulnerability disclosure? What's the best approach to take there?
Yeah, sure. So look, when we're kind of talking about vulnerability disclosure and we're talking about, the incidents that have occurred, you probably got to reflect on, the type of organization that you are and, who your regulator is. So one of the first things is, we in Australia, we have the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, and they are really the mechanism that enables the Privacy Act. So in Australia, we have our Privacy Act, which is like the framework around keeping data private, as you would expect. And there are Australian privacy principles within that. One of those principles is specific to, information security. So understanding what your regulatory requirements are there is going to be, really important, and understanding when you have to notify of an incident. Now, depending on, maybe other listeners are working for like an APRA regulated organization, or sorry, I should say entity, an APRA regulated entity. You'll have, your CPS 234 requirements. And, if anyone's working for like a very, very large organization, we've also got, some critical infrastructure legislation coming to Australia at the moment. So disclosing like, your vulnerabilities and things like that, you need to look at what your requirements are. And I would say if you do know about a vulnerability and you have a good awareness and understanding of that, you need to do something about it, because if that vulnerability is exploited and caused an incident, you would have a less favorable outcome because you knew and didn't take action. Last thing to cover as well is probably like the duty of care that, I'm going to get this wrong. If you're an ASIC licensee, so you hold a financial services license. You mentioned at the start RI advice.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes, that was a really interesting outcome there, because it wasn't a cybersecurity specific legislation. They really got them under duty of care there. So understanding that the game has changed, the way that this is what I was saying before, like, the regulatory, views and the public expectation on cybersecurity is changing very, very quickly. And you just want to, be ahead of the curve with that one. It's very likely that we will see very strong regulatory action for high profile or repeated data breaches.
Yeah, my take on it was just reading through some of that information was very much around the fact if you haven't done the right things, taken the right steps, that there is the potential that as a director of that business that you could end up being personally liable, which obviously is a slippery slope and is another degree of risk altogether. If I take a look at what I do on a day-to-day basis, one of the things that's amazing really is the amount of third-party software that we use just in our business here. Yeah, there's marketing systems, CRM systems. Obviously, we use the Microsoft range of products. Slack, something else that we use. So the list goes on and on. The intersection or the interaction of third-party software, what risks are inherent in that, and sort of where's the fine line between what's their responsibility and what's our responsibility?
Sure, that's a really interesting kind of area for us to dig into, Damo, because at the end of the day, you're normally responsible and accountable for what happens to the data that you receive from your clients. So we use so many third parties. You're absolutely correct. And, there's software as a service. There are, platforms as a service. And, if you're starting to move into the cloud, you may be using infrastructure as a service. And it's really important for you to understand, with the actual vendor that you're using, what they're going to do, because it comes back down to trust. So when you're putting the information that you collect into their systems, you are trusting that they have the security controls in place to keep that secure, which means that your customers trust that you have done your due diligence in actually making sure that that vendor is trustworthy, if that makes sense.
It does.
So this is what we talk about with supply chain risk. Because there are examples of IT service providers being compromised, and then that is used to deploy ransomware. We've had, I think SolarWinds is a really good example of this, big IT automation, and essentially it was used to deploy, I think it was a bunch of ransomware, everywhere to everyone that used it. And that's huge. So with your third parties, due diligence, getting information from them on what their security posture is, their incident response processes, making sure that you monitor them, all really important. But it's also really important to look at the other side of the coin, which is if you're a small, medium business, you may not have a lot of money to spend.
Absolutely.
Realistically. So this is where you can leverage the investment that your vendors are doing into security to help improve your security posture. So Microsoft, for example, I think they're investing like $2 billion into cybersecurity, this year alone.
Wow.
It's absolutely huge. A lot of the really big service providers, the typical organizations that you will use, they provide these services to a very, very large number of organizations and customers. They have a strong requirement to be secure, because if they're not, they fall victim to an incident. That's their entire business at risk. It's an existential threat for them. So you can never outsource your responsibility or accountability, but you can understand what the limitations that you have are and make intelligent decisions about what you use. And obviously, that you're using, trusted and reputable organizations to actually improve your security posture.
So to an extent, there's safety in size there from some of these providers. Would that be fair to say?
It can change on a dime. Is the unfortunate thing. And then so I'm hesitant to say, there's safety in size and things like that, but there's an element of, acceptable decision making that you can make.
Sure.
If you have conducted a thorough due diligence process, you can provide assurance to your customers in the event of an incident that you did really have a robust process in place. You made these decisions for these reasons. You maybe intelligently use the scale and size of an organization to help you improve your security posture. But the challenge is if they're really, really big, maybe they're a very, very good target. So it's always going to be a balancing act.
The flip side.
Correct. And it's a decision to kind of look at from two angles. And it really comes down to like risk and managing risk within your organization.
I think it's a very good point, and it's a useful tip because a lot of our audience, they are running SMEs. They don't have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that they can throw at this type of issue. So I think those comments are very, it's words of wisdom really for some of our audience. Can I take you down the path just a little bit in terms of worst case scenarios? So for any of our audience out there that may at some point find themselves, their security is being breached, data compromised, they're now the subject of a ransomware or demands. There's a lot of conjecture, certainly from the information I've read, as to whether those ransom demands should be paid, not paid, what that leads to. Does that lead to further requests? What have you seen? What's your experience been? And what are your thoughts on it?
So the pay, don't pay discussion is very big, and it's what I would call like an ethical and moral nightmare. The Australian government's position is that you shouldn't pay a ransom. So that's the formal position put out from there. And kind of digging into the detail of that is probably, it's quite a big thing. It's quite a complex and nuanced issue. So you've got to think that these threat actors are running businesses. So the whole like double extortion thing, for example, like that sort of stuff, they're trying to get you to pay. There's an element of like negotiation and that sort of stuff that actually occurs. So, something like the larger incidents that I'm aware of, incident responders actually contact the person who deployed the ransomware to negotiate, an amount and things like that.
Wow.
So maybe making it a bit more kind of like practical and actionable, because that's a really complicated decision to make. let's talk about like what ransomware does. I'm not sure if you've ever been the victim of a ransomware attack, and maybe for some of your listeners, if they have been, they could probably reflect on this. It's actually a very harrowing experience. I set up a lab at home, I think it was last year, and I just had a bunch of obviously in a controlled environment. I deployed a bunch of ransomware just to see what it looked like, and I was actually shocked. I was like, this is I wasn't expecting to feel uncomfortable after it, but if you were just doing your job and then suddenly everything closes, the work that you're working on, it's no longer there. And there's this message saying you've got to pay $20,000 or $1 million or more. That's terrible.
It's threatening and horrifying.
It is. But you've got to think about what have they done? They've taken away the access to your systems. So what would you normally do if one of your servers suddenly went offline? You would also normally, as I would say, hopefully, you would normally have a backup. So with ransomware, what I was saying at the start, we're really taking away the availability of your systems. So we want to talk then about resilience from it. So perfect world scenario is everything's patched and up to date, and you're taking backups, and then you're making sure that no one can access those, and you're also making sure that no one has changed those backups. So the integrity of your backups is really important for when we're talking about ransomware.
And how do you do that?
That's where you really need to talk to your IT, you're an IT expert in your organization.
Sure.
So taking backups is something that we have done for a very, very, very long time. And there are a variety of ways to make sure that they're the same thing that we took. I won't go into that. It might be, a little bit too techie,
We'll leave that for our next podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if it happens, hopefully you have, somebody that can help you out with incident response, like a managed security service provider or something like that. But generally speaking, if ransomware occurs, if your organization gets infected by ransomware, you want to be able to not pay the ransom and realistically just restore everything from the backup. That's the perfect world scenario.
Of course. In terms of affordability, one of the things, I think there's a general conception out there that to deploy the services of expert or security experts like your firm, that it may be out of reach. Is that a right or wrong presumption? Is it a case that there may just be certain aspects of your business or services that clients need, and that is quite affordable? And I guess I'm not just talking about your firm specifically, but the industry in general. For those SME type people out there that don't have those huge budgets, are there elements of security that are affordable?
So, maybe naively, I'm saying that there should be. And there should be a service provider that can offer you something which is proportionate to the needs of your organization. Now, you probably already have, if you're running an SME, you probably already have a relationship with an IT service provider. You're probably outsourcing some parts of your IT to someone. Now, obviously, my organization, so CyberCX, we provide services to a vast array of different organizations. In terms of the accessibility, in terms of the cost of cybersecurity services, at the moment we're really experiencing a typical economic supply and demand issue. There are not a lot of people who are what we would call cybersecurity experts or kind of able to provide good cybersecurity services against the needs of people who need those services. So there's kind of that the whole kind of crucible, perfect storm is probably the better term for it, of we really, really need this stuff. There's not a lot of people who can do it, and that drives up the prices of it. In those cases, when you're a smaller organization, my advice to you would be to look at what you currently use. A really good example is Microsoft. I said that they were investing $2 billion in cybersecurity products, and this is my personal opinion, they are doing a very, very good job in having security solutions and things like that integrate really well into what they're doing. You're going to have to pay for it. But what you need to think about is, how much can I afford to pay? What do my customers expect me to do? And then, find that right line there. As a basis, some of like the kind of things that we can do that isn't going to be too expensive is going to be having, strong passwords. So really like pass phrases. So, have like a long sentence rather than maybe your dog's name and the year of your birth. Making sure that you are keeping your software and your systems up to date with with patches and security updates. You can also kind of justify upgrading your IT infrastructure when security gets brought into the mix as well. Because maybe you don't want to, maybe your organization hasn't wanted to spend money on buying new stuff, but actually the new stuff that we have is, it's faster, it's more efficient, and we can secure it. So there are a few benefits to actually, keeping up to date with some of the technology. Providing regular cybersecurity training for employees. Now, CyberCX does have our, kind of like the Cyber 123s for SMEs.
Sure. And
that's a free service that we have on our website. And I would encourage, all of your listeners to go to that. So it's cybercx.com, and you'll see that there's some links on the page there to get access to it. That's a really good way of kind of getting some like the security awareness training that you need.
Okay.
And then making sure that your employees have that. Maybe having a think about the way your business operates. So if we can't spend money on expensive security tooling and things like that, perhaps we need to think about the processes that our staff follow, and just making sure that we're thinking about, the correct handling of data. Maybe we're not giving everyone in the office access to everything and only the stuff that they need. Also, probably like the kind of coming back to a point I made earlier, engaging a third-party security provider. You'll get economies of scale with a managed service security provider. CyberCX provides those types of services, and there's a variety of different organizations out there. You'll get the economy of scale at that point in time, and that's a relatively safe thing for you to consider.
Sure. So really it's about a mixture of what you can be purchasing or the expert services that you can outsource to, but also looking internally at some of those preventative type measures that you can take that aren't going to cost you anything really, and are quite simple but can be effective.
So just on that, and this is maybe an issue that I have with the approach that we kind of typically see that happens with cybersecurity, is we're obsessed with preventing things. So, back in the day, you put an antivirus, on the computers and you'd think everything's fine. But a very, limited skill, individual such as myself can find ways to bypass those preventative controls. So we need to think about how we can detect if something has occurred, how we can, respond to that, hopefully before data's been stolen or something like that. So it's not just preventing things, it's probably accepting that we can't prevent everything. So we need to have, a bit more depth. So like think about layers of an onion, defense in depth is what we call it. Having a bit more depth so that if something happens, like an employee clicks on the wrong thing, there's, we've done some things so that, whoever gets access to that particular computer maybe can't access everything that your company has. So being able to prevent is so important. But you need to be able to identify all the systems that connect to your network in order for you to do that. So if you can't identify what you've got, you can't prevent all your cybersecurity attacks. If you can't detect if something has occurred, if you're not doing audits and things like that, that's also, going to be a potential kind of like blind spot for you.
That makes complete sense. So it's about not just preventing, but realizing where there are potentially problems, how you deal with that. And I would think, to your point before, one of the best ways to do that is to just raise your general awareness of security threats and what you should be doing. And as you said, you guys have got some free tools on your website. So I think that sort of thing is great, and I'd encourage all of our listeners to check that out. I'm going to throw one last question at you, Kieran. So I'm very curious to know, we all know what's happening at the moment, the way that these threats are coming through. Where do you see the future of these threats, the future of cybersecurity? Are there any new trends that we need to look out for or need to be aware of?
So I'm going to kind of be a little bit boring here and say that it's probably going to be more of the same that we have experienced. So as much as I want to say there's going to be threats with AI and quantum computing and things like that, yes, there absolutely are. And Chat GPT, which is this new AI that you can ask questions, can write malware and that sort of stuff. But because generally we don't have that kind of what I call the cyber hygiene in place. We don't manage our passwords and our access particularly well. We don't know where everything is. It's kind of those basic security controls. We probably are going to see more of the same. And at the moment, the same is ransomware.
Sure.
Now, one thing that is changing is, there's a lot more government action, particularly that we're seeing with ransomware. They are kind of starting to hack back a little bit. In Australia, the Home Affairs Minister has, sent some kind of clear messages around what our response is. You also get, organizations like the FBI who recently took down a big ransomware group as well. So the way that extortion works maybe will change a little bit, but kind of going back to what I said before, more of the same sorts of stuff are going to continue to occur until we get really good at the basics.
That's really interesting to hear. I think one of the other things, of course, that has been mentioned quite a bit, particularly in financial planning circles, is the ability for clients to have access to a client portal. Do you want to touch on that? Just from a consumer perspective, is that beneficial? Is it beneficial for the financial planning business? Is it something you'd recommend?
So the most important thing to remember is that security always needs to be functional. So we need to have businesses that have attractive service offerings so that we can, retain and grow our client base. So, if you're a financial advisor, you want to be able to offer services to your customers that maybe give you a little bit of an edge and, give or meet your kind of customers' expectations. So when we're talking about kind of new and innovative ways like customer portals, that sort of things, there are ways to do that securely. And there are always going to be risks, but at the end of the day, it's, we still need to make money in our businesses. So there's going to be an element of what the cyber risk is, what our customers expect and, what an appropriate level of, security control is for us to have in place. So I would definitely encourage organizations to innovate, but I would encourage them to innovate securely. So what I mean by that is that the internet was never made to be secure. We bolt everything on, from a security standpoint. So think about how you can bake in security. If you do have, an IT team within your organization who is developing software, really think about how they can be baking security into what they're doing and have, a good core set of principles in place to make sure that the services you do offer to customers have, things like the principles of least privilege in place. Make sure that you're running it on, modern IT assets, not something from, the early 2000s.
Sure. Well, Kieran, thank you for today. It's been an incredible chat. I think a lot of useful tips for our audience out there. I'd encourage any of our listeners, as I said before, to check out you and your website. But thank you so much for joining me today, Kieran.
Thanks, Damo. Much appreciated.
Cheers.